There were several towns in Kansas that served as shipping points where Texas cattle were loaded on railroad cars and shipped to the markets back east, Abilene and Ellsworth and Wichita and others. But as the railroad moved west, so did the cattle drives. And for about 10 years, Dodge City became the main shipping point, and the town became quite notorious. This one's called Once Upon a Time in Dodge City. There were several saloons in Dodge City where the drovers could go to unwind. After months on the trail driving cattle to the rail, they had whiskey and women in mind. On the ashes of a cowboy's campfire, the town of Dodge City was built. To say it was wild would be putting it mild. It was lawless, with no shame or guilt. There was gambling, bordellos, 16 saloons where a man could sure drink his fill. There were cowboys and gamblers, soldiers and ramblers who sometimes wound up on Boot Hill. It was called the Babylon of the Frontier by the editors of the papers back east. There were no holds barred, and if you cheated at cards, your odds for survival decreased. The residents of the town varied somewhat, from a gunfighter, card shark, or thief to God-fearing settlers, merchants and peddlers, and cattle buyers looking for beef. In the 1870s, some 5 million cattle were driven to Dodge City for sale, and fables abound about the men in the town, and this is one of those tales. A herd had just come up from Texas, 3,000 longhorns at least. They drove them this far to load them on cars and ship them to the market back east. And along with the cattle came the cowboys, dirty, hungry men, tall and lean, craving home-cooked grub and a bath in a tub. They'd been living on trail dust and beans, and they longed for the taste of good whiskey and the sight of a gal in a dress, the smell of perfume in an upstairs room, and the thrill of a woman's caress. With this group of rowdy cowpunchers was a young man out on his own, kid 17, kind of awkward and green. It was the first time he'd been away from home. The cattle were sold and loaded on the cars. The cowboys' work was all done. They collected their pay, each went his own way, seeking his own kind of fun. Some of the men got a haircut and shaved. Others bought new clothes, shirts, coats. But most, I presume, went straight to the saloon to wash the trail dust out of their throats. Now, this lad wasn't hip to the ways of the world, and a little naive as well. He opted instead for clean sheets and a bed in a room at the local hotel. To him, that'd be quite a contrast from sleeping on the ground that was hard, the stiffness and pain, the nights when it rained, and the nights when he had to stand guard. He pulled off his boots and stretched out on the bed, recalling all he'd done and seen. He was glad it was over, 'cause the life of a drover is hard for a kid 17. The trials of the trail had been many, but there were some good times as well. He'd remember 'em all. And when he got home that fall, he'd sure have some stories to tell about the races to the chuck wagon. "Come and get it," the grouchy cook squalled, and how they joked all along that the night herder's song was so sad that the cattle even bawled, and how them horses that bucked every morning were the ones that had the most speed, and about the rivers they crossed and the cattle they lost when the lightning bolt caused a stampede. The buddy they'd buried out there on the trail, victim of a rattlesnake bite, and the tears that he shed that night in his bed. I expect he growed up some that night. And after 2 months on the prairie, how them old hands had but one thought: the dance-hall girls with their long blonde curls, whose affection and love could be bought. Now, the train that was hauling the cattle back east came west about a week ago, carrying a passenger inside that would soon be a bride. She came west to marry her beau. Came all the way from St. Louis. She'd growed up there, proper and right, and she'd met this young man, and a romance began. Guess it was love at first sight. But last year he'd went to Ford County, went there to prove up a homestead, and he wrote in each letter that from the first time he met her, he hoped someday they would wed. He sent her a one-way ticket to Dodge. They'd be married. She'd given her consent. But she was soon to discover that her sweetheart and lover had been killed in a freak accident. A mare he was breaking to harness was horsing. She squealed when he reached for the tug, kicked hard and high, hit him just above the eye, and he fell as if shot with a slug. Neighbor come by and found him, took him to the dock, and he tried, but blood was gushing, had a concussion, and later that evening he died. The funeral took all the money she had. Didn't even have enough to get home. That blow that fate handed had left her stranded with no money, no job, all alone. She looked all over town for a job. She was smitten with grief and half crazed, but times were bad. No jobs to be had for an innocent young girl, Christian raised. From his bed, the cowboy heard laughter from the saloon. The music was casting a spell, and as he lay there he thought that it sounded somewhat like the devil luring folks into hell. And he wondered what lay behind those swinging doors. Well, this was his chance to find out. Were they fantasies or realities, those pleasures the men talked about? The young girl, too, heard the music, and embarrassed, she ventured inside. She was hungry and tired, and asked to be hired. 'Twas the only place she hadn't tried. Her conscience had given way to necessity. It was that or sleep on the street. She was hurting inside from swallowing her pride, but even a girl has to eat. The lady in charge was sympathetic. She'd been there herself long ago. Said you'd give her a chance to dance and romance with the cowboys and help spend their dough. She bought her a meal, gave her room, loaned her a tight-fitting dress. She's thinking what might have been when our cowboy walked in. A meeting predestined, I guess. He tipped his hat and said howdy. Her smile had a look of despair, and with their innocence showing, they ended up going to her room at the top of the stairs. She closed the door, went over to the bed, started removing her stocking. Then she started to cry. The cowboy was shy. They spent the whole night there, just talking about home, the way that they'd been brought up. And in doing so, they finally conceded that this wild fling was surely something that neither one wanted or needed. They slipped out of the room before daylight, and they walked without heading nowhere, together yet alone, wishing they was home, and not knowing for sure how to get there. What was left of his outfit was camped by the river with the horses they'd used on the trail, so he asked the boss if he'd sell him a horse. He said the whole darn remuda's for sale. It took most of his pay, but he picked out a couple, bought 'em. They cinched up the leather, filled their canteens, took some jerky and beans, and headed towards Texas together. Some 70 years later, a stranger came to Dodge from way down in Texas somewhere. He looked all around and he asked folks in town if a certain saloon was still there. A few of the old-timers remembered it well, but the town had considered it a disgrace. It was closed long ago, but they were anxious to know why the stranger's concerned for the place. So they showed him the place where the saloon had been. Except for memories, it was empty and bare. Then he told them why, as he said with a sigh, "My grandpa had grandma in there."